January 1944. The desert air of southern Arizona is cold before sunrise. Barbed wire stretches across the flat land in long, deliberate lines, catching the first pale light of morning. Guard towers stand silent. Inside the fence, wooden barracks sit in orderly rows, their shadows long and thin on the sand. A bell rings, not harsh, not urgent, just routine. Men begin to emerge, Japanese soldiers, former infantrymen, sailors, medics, once taught that capture was worse than death, now standing in line for breakfast. Steam rises from metal trays, bread, coffee, calories measured, recorded, repeated. No beatings, no screams, no interrogations. The guards watch from a distance, rifles slung, posture relaxed. Some prisoners look down, others stare straight ahead, uncertain where dignity now resides. For many, this place was never meant to exist. Back home, they had been told America was cruel, decadent, and savage, that prisoners were tortured, that surrender erased honor forever. Yet here, survival continues, quietly, relentlessly, inside a system built by the very enemy they were taught to fear. The contradiction does not announce itself. It settles in slowly, and as the days pass, belief begins to fracture. To understand how these moments became possible, the world that shaped them must come into focus.
Long before the barbed wire of Arizona, before the silence of American camps, the fate of Japanese prisoners of war had already been decided by ideas forged decades earlier. Imperial Japan entered the 20th century carrying the weight of rapid modernization and ancient tradition. The Meiji Restoration had transformed the nation into an industrial and military power, but its armed forces were shaped as much by ideology as by steel. At the center stood a reinterpreted version of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Loyalty to the emperor was absolute. Obedience was sacred. Death in service was not tragedy, but fulfillment. By the 1930s, this belief system had been formalized inside the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. Military manuals made little provision for surrender. Training emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and unquestioning resolve. Soldiers were taught that capture was a disgrace not only to themselves, but to their families and ancestors. The enemy, especially Western enemies, were portrayed as morally weak and inherently cruel. To be taken alive was to lose one's place in society forever. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, these ideas moved from doctrine into blood-soaked reality. Japanese forces advanced rapidly through Southeast Asia and the Pacific, seizing Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and vast stretches of island territory. Early victories reinforced confidence in both military superiority and spiritual righteousness. Propaganda organs within Japan, newspapers, radio broadcasts, posters, presented the conflict as a sacred struggle against corrupt Western empires. Within this worldview, there was no space for the concept of a humane enemy prison camp. Japanese soldiers were repeatedly warned that if captured by Americans, they would face torture, starvation, or execution. Such claims were not abstract, they were reinforced by Japan's own conduct toward prisoners earlier in the war. Treatment of Allied POWs in Japanese custody, on the Bataan Death March, in camps across Southeast Asia, and aboard transport ships was brutal and often lethal. Many Japanese soldiers assumed, logically, that the enemy would behave the same way. As the war progressed, however, reality began to intrude. The Pacific conflict was unlike any war Japan had fought before. The distances were vast, supply lines were fragile, attrition was relentless. Battles such as Guadalcanal in late 1942 marked a turning point. For the first time, Japanese forces were not advancing, they were retreating. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion began claiming more lives than combat itself. In these conditions, surrender, once unthinkable, became unavoidable for some. Isolated units ran out of ammunition, wounded soldiers were left behind, sailors were pulled from the sea after ship sinkings. In New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Aleutians, American forces captured increasing numbers of Japanese personnel, often shocked to find prisoners who expected execution at any moment. By mid-1943, the number of Japanese POWs held by the United States had grown into the thousands. Though small compared to German and Italian captives, they presented a unique challenge. Many refused to give their names, some attempted suicide rather than be taken alive. Others attacked fellow prisoners suspected of cooperating with captors. The U.S. military, for its part, approached the situation from a very different tradition. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. While Japan had signed but not ratified the agreement, American leadership emphasized adherence to its standards, both for moral reasons and strategic ones. Treatment of POWs was seen as a reflection of national values and as leverage in hopes of protecting American prisoners held overseas. As Japanese captives were transported across the Pacific, often blindfolded and uncertain of their fate, they carried with them a lifetime of instruction that told them survival itself was a failure. They did not yet know where they were going, or how deeply the experience ahead would challenge everything they had been taught to believe. That journey, across oceans and into the heart of the American mainland, would become the setting where ideology met reality.
The journey from the Pacific battlefield to the American mainland was deliberately disorienting. Japanese prisoners were moved first to temporary holding facilities in Hawaii or on the West Coast, often under strict security and minimal explanation. Many believed the voyage itself was a prelude to execution. Ships crossed the ocean in silence. Guards avoided unnecessary contact. Orders were given in clipped English, sometimes translated by bilingual intermediaries. For men conditioned to expect brutality, the absence of violence felt almost more unsettling. Upon arrival in the continental United States, the scale of the American war effort became impossible to ignore. Railway cars carried prisoners inland for days, sometimes weeks. Through small windows or cracks in wooden slats, they saw landscapes that contradicted everything wartime propaganda had described. Endless farmland, towns untouched by bombing, factories running at full capacity, civilian life continuing with an almost unsettling normality. By 1943 and 1944, the United States had established a nationwide prisoner of war camp system designed to hold hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. Most were Germans and Italians, but several dozen camps were designated to receive Japanese prisoners as well. These facilities were spread across the country: Arizona, Texas, Wyoming, Wisconsin, Montana, chosen for isolation, rail access, and availability of land. Administration of the camps fell under the office of the Provost Marshal General. Regulations were standardized. Rations were calculated to match those issued to American troops. Medical care was provided by U.S. Army doctors. The International Red Cross was granted access to inspect conditions, file reports, and communicate with Geneva. For Japanese POWs, this structure was bewildering. Barracks were crude but clean. Latrines were functional. Food was monotonous but sufficient. There were work details, kitchen duty, camp maintenance, agricultural labor, but they were paid as required by international law. Punishments existed, but they were regulated. Arbitrary violence was officially forbidden. This was not mercy in the abstract. It was policy. American leadership understood that Japanese prisoners were a psychological outlier. Unlike German captives, many Japanese soldiers did not attempt escape. They did not expect repatriation. Some believed their families had already been notified of their death in battle. Others assumed that survival in captivity would condemn them to social exile forever. The U.S. military responded with a mix of caution and experimentation. Special intelligence units, including the Military Intelligence Service, began studying Japanese POW behavior closely. Interrogations were conducted not through coercion, but through patience. Guards were instructed to avoid humiliation. Officers were warned that forcing compliance could provoke violence or suicide. Instead, the goal was gradual stabilization, reducing fear before extracting information. Inside the camps, American authorities also faced internal divisions among the prisoners themselves. Rank still mattered. Officers expected deference. Non-commissioned officers attempted to enforce discipline. Some prisoners clung fiercely to pre-war beliefs, punishing those who showed signs of adaptation or cooperation. In several camps, ideological hardliners organized intimidation campaigns against fellow captives. Beatings occurred. In rare cases, killings followed, forcing American commanders to segregate prisoners based on attitude and rank. Yet even amid tension, cracks in the propaganda began to form. Prisoners were allowed to read censored newspapers. Some listened to American radio broadcasts. Educational programs were introduced, initially to occupy time, later to prepare prisoners for post-war return. English classes, basic mathematics, and vocational training slowly entered camp routines. For many Japanese POWs, this was the first sustained exposure to unfiltered information. Reports of Allied advances, news of defeats in the Philippines and the Central Pacific, the growing weight of evidence that Japan was not winning the war. The contrast between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. If Americans were the monsters described in wartime sermons, why did they follow rules so closely? If surrender erased honor completely, why were prisoners still alive, fed, and treated as soldiers rather than criminals? These questions did not produce immediate answers. They produced silence, reflection, and in some cases, quiet resentment. But over time, the camps became something more than holding facilities. They became environments where belief systems collided, where decades of indoctrination met lived experience, day after day, meal after meal, and within that collision, individual perspectives began to diverge. Some prisoners resisted every accommodation, others adapted quickly. A few began to rethink the very foundations of what they had been taught. Those differences, human, cultural, psychological, would define life inside the wire.
For the individual Japanese prisoner, captivity was not defined first by hunger or physical suffering, but by dislocation of identity. Most had entered the war believing their personal worth was inseparable from service to the emperor. Rank, unit, and sacrifice formed a moral architecture that gave meaning to endurance and death alike. Capture shattered that structure instantly. Inside American camps, there were no battle orders, no ceremonial displays of loyalty, no opportunity for redemption through combat. Instead, there was time. Time to wake without gunfire, time to eat without rationing, time to think. For many, this was unbearable. Diaries later recovered describe overwhelming shame, not for defeat, but for continued existence. Some prisoners refused food. Others turned their faces to the wall and spoke to no one. Suicide attempts, though not widespread, occurred most often in the first weeks of captivity, when belief had not yet adapted to circumstance. Yet survival continued, regardless of ideology. Bodies demanded calories, wounds healed, routine imposed itself. Gradually, the raw edge of shock dulled. Men began noticing small details, the consistency of meals, the absence of arbitrary punishment, the way guards addressed them by rank rather than insult. These observations did not immediately produce trust, they produced confusion, and confusion, over time, opened space for reassessment.
Everyday life inside U.S. camps exposed cultural contrasts far removed from the battlefield. Food was the most immediate shock. Bread, potatoes, coffee, beef, items unfamiliar or symbolically foreign to many Japanese prisoners, became daily staples. Some refused to eat meat at first. Others grew ill adjusting to new diets. American cooks occasionally attempted to modify meals, adding rice when supplies allowed, not as concession but practicality. Hygiene routines differed sharply. American emphasis on sanitation, regular bathing, and medical inspections contrasted with field conditions many prisoners had endured for months or years. The presence of doctors who treated illness without interrogation unsettled assumptions about enemy cruelty. Language barriers deepened isolation. Few prisoners spoke English. Orders were conveyed through interpreters or gestures. Misunderstandings were frequent. Yet over time, shared routines created a functional rhythm. Countless small interactions, receiving mail, reporting sick, lining up for work, became lessons in how the enemy organized daily life. For some prisoners, this exposure bred resentment. For others, it sparked curiosity. And for a few, it planted the first doubts about the moral simplicity of wartime narratives. The most profound conflict inside the camps was invisible. Cognitive dissonance settled in quietly. Japanese prisoners had been taught that Americans lacked discipline, honor, and restraint, yet the system around them operated with methodical consistency. Rules were enforced not through terror, but procedure. Authority existed, but it was bounded. This contradiction forced prisoners to reconcile two incompatible realities, what they had been told and what they were living. Some resolved the tension by dismissing their experience as temporary illusion. Others doubled down on ideology, insisting that kindness was a deceptive tactic. But a growing number could not ignore the evidence accumulating day after day. Psychologists studying POW behavior later noted a gradual shift from collective identity toward individual reflection. Removed from unit pressure in battlefield immediacy, prisoners began thinking about family, childhood, and futures that no longer aligned with heroic death. These internal changes did not announce themselves. They unfolded in silence, behind barrack walls, under desert skies, and they set the stage for deeper fractures between prisoners, between belief systems, and between past and present. Those fractures would only widen as the structures of authority and power inside the camps came into sharper focus. Behind the calm routine of camp life stood a system engineered for scale and control. American POW camps were not improvised. They were standardized installations built according to War Department blueprints. Barracks dimensions, fence spacing, watchtower placement, and guard rotations followed precise regulations. The goal was not punishment, but containment, secure enough to prevent escape, orderly enough to minimize unrest. For Japanese prisoners, this environment revealed a form of power that did not rely on constant intimidation. Authority was embedded in infrastructure. Movement was regulated by schedules. Compliance was produced by predictability. In this system, resistance carried few rewards and many consequences, most of them social rather than violent. Work programs formed a central part of camp administration. Prisoners were assigned to labor details, farming, maintenance, construction, under supervision. They were paid small wages, credited to accounts they could use to purchase toiletries, stationery, or extra food. This arrangement confused many Japanese POWs. Payment implied agency. Agency implied a form of dignity they had been taught was forfeited upon capture. Leadership inside the wire became a contested space. Japanese officers retained nominal authority over enlisted men, but only within boundaries enforced by American commanders. Orders that violated camp regulations were overwritten. Physical punishment between prisoners was prohibited. For officers accustomed to absolute control, this limitation was humiliating. Some adapted by acting as intermediaries, translating orders and maintaining discipline within acceptable limits. Others resisted, attempting to reassert ideological purity. These efforts often led to conflict. American records document instances where hardline leaders intimidated or assaulted fellow prisoners suspected of cooperation or westernization. U.S. camp commanders responded by separating prisoners based on behavior rather than rank. Those deemed cooperative were moved to different compounds. This policy weakened traditional hierarchies and accelerated ideological fragmentation. Loyalty was no longer enforced solely by fear of authority, but tested by individual choice. Perception flowed in both directions. American guards, many of them young and newly enlisted, arrived with their own assumptions. Japanese soldiers were seen as fanatical, unpredictable, even subhuman, images shaped by Pacific battlefield reports and domestic propaganda. Early interactions were tense. Guards were instructed never to turn their backs. Over time, familiarity altered those perceptions. Routine contact replaced abstract fear. Guards observed prisoners working, reading, playing improvised sports, writing letters. Some learned basic Japanese phrases. Mutual distrust did not vanish, but it softened. This shift did not imply friendship, it reflected normalization. The enemy became human through repetition, not ideology. At the core of the camp experience lay a moral confrontation. Japanese POWs were forced to navigate a system that offered survival without honor as they had defined it. The American system, in turn, tested its own values by extending legal protections to men responsible for brutal combat against its forces. Neither side emerged unchanged. For prisoners, moral certainty eroded. For guards, simplistic hatred lost coherence. The camp became a space where war's binaries blurred, not through speeches or persuasion, but through structure and time. These pressures accumulated quietly, and as the war's trajectory outside the wire grew increasingly bleak for Japan, the internal contradictions reached a breaking point. The moment when belief could no longer coexist with reality was approaching. By late 1944, the rhythm inside the camps began to change, not in routine, not in structure, but in awareness. News filtered in slowly at first, carefully controlled, delayed, yet impossible to fully contain. American newspapers carried maps shaded in advancing Allied colors. Headlines spoke of island names once presented in Japan as impregnable: Saipan, Guam, Leyte, now fallen. Radios, even when restricted, carried fragments of information. Prisoners compared notes. Rumors were weighed, dismissed, then quietly reconsidered. For many Japanese POWs, this was the first time the war's direction became undeniable. At Saipan in July 1944, entire Japanese units had been annihilated. Thousands of civilians died alongside soldiers. The scale of loss was unprecedented and impossible to reconcile with official claims of strategic withdrawals and glorious resistance. Prisoners who had served in the Central Pacific recognized the implications immediately. Saipan placed American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The war was no longer distant, it was approaching home. Inside the camps, reactions varied sharply. Some prisoners refused to acknowledge the reports, accusing others of spreading enemy lies. Hardline factions intensified pressure, attempting to preserve ideological cohesion through intimidation. Fights broke out. American guards intervened more frequently, imposing segregation to prevent violence. But for others, something irreversible had begun. The realization was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no collective declarations. Instead, there was silence. Men sitting on bunks long after lights out, letters written and rewritten, then torn up, questions that had no safe audience. If the war is lost, what remains of duty, of shame, of survival? Educational programs, initially tolerated as distractions, took on new meaning. English classes became tools not just of communication, but comprehension. Prisoners read about American history, about labor movements, about democratic institutions that contradicted caricatures of chaos and moral decay. The contrast sharpened painfully. If the enemy was weak, how had it mobilized so completely? If Americans were cruel, why did their system continue to function without cruelty as its engine? These questions did not produce admiration. They produced fracture between belief and evidence. American intelligence officers noticed the shift. Interrogations grew more productive, not because prisoners volunteered secrets freely, but because fear had lost some of its power. Men spoke not out of loyalty to captors, but exhaustion with falsehoods that no longer held. By early 1945, whispers of catastrophe reached even the most isolated compounds. Tokyo had been bombed repeatedly. Firestorms had consumed entire neighborhoods. Civilian casualties were mounting. Prisoners learned of raids not through Japanese sources, but through neutral or American reporting. The tone was factual, stripped of heroic framing. For those who had families in the cities, the news carried a weight heavier than ideology. The propaganda that once promised inevitability now felt hollow. The camp, once a place of humiliation, became a place where reality, however painful, was at least consistent. The wire no longer defined the deepest boundary. Belief did. And then, in the summer of 1945, information arrived that no belief system could fully absorb. It came not as rumor, but as confirmation. Something unprecedented had happened.
August 1945 did not arrive inside the camps as a single moment. It arrived in fragments. First, there were unusual delays. Work details were shortened. Guard briefings grew longer. Radios, once allowed at specific hours, were restricted again. Prisoners sensed a shift before they understood it. Something had happened beyond the wire, something large enough to disrupt even the rigid calm of the system. Then the information came. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. American officers did not dramatize the news. They read it plainly. A new weapon. Entire cities destroyed. Casualty estimates spoken without adjectives. For many prisoners, the words themselves were difficult to grasp. Bombing was familiar, fire was familiar, but this scale, this finality, exceeded the mental frameworks built during years of war. Silence followed. Some prisoners refused to believe it. Others asked for maps, distances, explanations. A few sat motionless, staring at floors worn smooth by months of pacing. The weapon was not just destructive, it rendered sacrifice meaningless. Courage could not stop it. Endurance could not absorb it. Death, once framed as honorable resistance, now appeared arbitrary. Days later, the Emperor spoke. The broadcast reached the camps through translated summaries and official announcements. The tone was formal, restrained, unmistakable. Japan would accept the terms of surrender. The war was over. For Japanese prisoners of war, this moment collapsed the last remaining barrier between captivity and truth. Men who had expected execution were now survivors of a defeated empire. Those who believed surrender erased identity now faced a future defined by survival alone. Some wept openly. Others did not react at all. Guards noted neither celebration nor unrest, only an eerie stillness that settled over the compounds. The surrender did not feel like relief, it felt like suspension. Questions replaced fear. What would return mean? Would families accept them? Would society? Would they be punished for living? American psychological assessments from the period describe widespread emotional numbness among Japanese POWs in the weeks following the announcement. The war had demanded everything from them. Now it demanded understanding. Inside the camps, discipline relaxed slightly. educational programs expanded. Discussions, once dangerous, became permissible. Prisoners asked about democracy, labor rights, post-war reconstruction, not out of admiration, but necessity. The ideological ground beneath them had vanished. Some American officers later wrote that this period marked the first time many Japanese POWs spoke freely, not about military matters, but about doubt, about regret, about confusion. The enemy they had been trained to hate had become the witness to their disillusionment. When preparations for repatriation began, they were meticulous and impersonal. Medical exams, paperwork, lists. Ships assembled not for conquest, but return. As prisoners packed their belongings, few as they were, the camps no longer felt like instruments of defeat. They felt like thresholds. Beyond them lay a Japan forever changed, and behind them an experience that would quietly shape how these men understood war, truth, and authority for the rest of their lives. What followed did not bring closure. It brought consequences.
The end of the war did not immediately open the gates. For weeks, Japanese prisoners of war remained inside the camps, suspended between identities. They were no longer enemy combatants, but not yet civilians. Orders from Washington emphasized control and caution. Repatriation would happen, but it would happen slowly, deliberately, and under strict supervision. Medical examinations came first. American doctors documented malnutrition, untreated tropical diseases, psychological shock. Many prisoners were healthier than expected, a fact quietly noted in U.S. Army reports. Weight had stabilized, wounds had healed. Mortality rates inside American camps were low, far lower than those experienced by Allied POWs held by Japan. The contrast was not lost on American officials compiling post-war assessments. Paperwork followed. Names were confirmed, ranks verified, units cross-checked. For men who had once refused to identify themselves, this process carried symbolic weight. To give one's name again was to accept survival as fact. Some complied readily, others hesitated, aware that documentation would follow them home. American intelligence officers conducted final interviews, not interrogations, but debriefings. The emphasis was no longer tactical information, it was understanding. How had propaganda functioned? Which messages held longest? Where had belief cracked first? These answers would later shape occupation policy in Japan. As preparations continued, the camps changed character. Work details ended. Guard posture relaxed. Educational sessions expanded further, now openly framed as preparation for life after return. Prisoners learned about post-war shortages, occupation authorities, and the likelihood of social disruption. Nothing was sugar-coated. American briefings were blunt, sometimes uncomfortably so. For many Japanese POWs, this honesty was the final and most disorienting contrast. Transport ships assembled on the West Coast in stages. Prisoners were moved in groups, escorted but no longer treated as security risks. Red Cross officials observed embarkations. Reports noted compliance, order, and an absence of resistance. The war had exhausted defiance. When the ships departed, there were no cheers. Men stood at rails, watching the American coastline recede. Some bowed toward the land they were leaving. Others did not look back at all. What awaited them across the Pacific was uncertain, but it was undeniably real. Back in Japan, the country they returned to barely resembled the one they had left. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was shattered, food shortages were severe. The emperor remained, but his status had changed. Occupation forces were everywhere, visible, methodical, unignorable. For former POWs, reintegration was not guaranteed. In many communities, capture still carried stigma. Families who believed sons and husbands dead struggled to reconcile survival with honor. Some returnees concealed their captivity. Others were open, only to encounter silence or discomfort.
American government policy offered limited support. The nation was rebuilding, and individual shame was not a priority. Yet the experience of American captivity did not vanish. Former prisoners carried with them memories that complicated simple narratives of victimhood or righteousness. They had seen the enemy's society up close. They had lived inside a system that contradicted the warnings they believed without question. Those memories would surface gradually, in testimony, in private conversations, in post-war studies conducted by Japanese scholars seeking to understand how belief had been engineered and how it had failed. The consequences of captivity were not loud. They unfolded quietly over years, and they extended far beyond the men who had lived behind the wire.
In post-war Japan, silence became a form of survival. Former prisoners returned to a society struggling to process defeat. Public narratives focused on destruction, hunger, and occupation. There was little space for nuance. Capture by the enemy did not fit easily into stories of endurance or sacrifice. For many former POWs, discretion felt safer than explanation. Some avoided discussing their captivity entirely. Others reframed it as forced labor or overseas hardship, omitting the word prisoner. A few spoke openly, only to find that listeners did not know how to respond. Shame was rarely expressed aloud, but it lingered in gestures, pauses, and omissions. Yet beneath the surface, the experience mattered. Japanese scholars and journalists, particularly in the late 1940s and 1950s, began collecting testimonies. They noticed patterns. Former POWs often demonstrated a sharper awareness of propaganda techniques. They described how absolute claims collapsed when confronted with consistent, lived contradiction. Many expressed lingering distrust, not of America, but of the certainty with which they had once been instructed to believe. For occupation authorities, these insights were valuable. U.S. planners working under General Douglas MacArthur's administration studied POW behavior closely. Reports from American camps informed decisions about re-education, censorship, and political reform. The goal was not humiliation, but structural change, reducing the likelihood that ideology could again demand total obedience without question. Former POWs occupied an ambiguous position in this transformation. They were not leaders, they were not symbols, but they were witnesses to an alternative system of authority, one that functioned without ritualized sacrifice. Some became teachers, others worked in local administrations. A few contributed to early post-war labor movements, influenced by experiences of regulated work and collective bargaining observed in captivity. Their influence was subtle, often indirect. Within families, stories passed quietly to children, about guards who followed rules, about enemies who did not behave as monsters, about how certainty dissolved not through argument, but exposure. These narratives did not absolve suffering, they complicated it. American records, declassified decades later, reflect a similar ambivalence. Officials noted that humane treatment of Japanese POWs did not produce immediate loyalty or gratitude. What it produced was credibility. Over time, that credibility proved more destabilizing to wartime propaganda than coercion ever could have been. The camps themselves disappeared. Barracks were dismantled, fences came down, land returned to farmland or desert. Little remains today beyond foundations and archival photographs. Yet the impact of those places persists in documents, memoirs, and the quiet recalibration of belief that occurred within them. The experience did not redeem war. It did not erase responsibility or suffering. But it revealed something enduring about human systems under stress. That revelation would echo long after uniforms were folded away. What remained was not victory or defeat, but understanding, hard-earned, incomplete, and deeply human.
The barbed wire is gone. The guard towers are empty. Only the wind moves across the flat landscape of the former camps, carrying whispers of lives once contained. For Japanese prisoners of war, captivity in the United States was more than survival. It was confrontation, an unrelenting collision between belief and reality. The ideologies that had shaped their courage, their shame, and their sense of duty were tested not by battle, but by the quiet discipline of an enemy who followed rules instead of rhetoric. The experience revealed the fragility of absolute certainty. Men trained to see surrender as dishonor and the enemy as monstrous discovered that the world could operate according to logic, order, and restraint, even within the context of war. That realization did not erase their suffering or the violence endured elsewhere, but it redefined it. It offered a lens through which to understand truth, obedience, and morality under pressure. For the Americans, it was proof that principles mattered, that humane treatment, grounded in law and procedure, could yield insight, reduce violence, and challenge the rigid propaganda of an enemy. For the world, it was a settled demonstration of the human capacity to reconcile conflict with compassion and order with uncertainty. Ultimately, the story of Japanese POWs in U.S. camps is not about victory or defeat. It is about the quiet resilience of the mind when confronted with contradiction, the recalibration of belief when faced with evidence, and the enduring tension between ideology and lived experience. And as the sun rises over the empty barracks today, one can almost hear the echoes of footsteps and whispered reflections, proof that even in the shadows of war, understanding can survive.